On this episode, I'm speaking with Mike Brewer, COO at RADCO. Mike has received numerous industry honors, including 7 Property Management Company of the Year awards under his leadership, and he's a frequent contributor to industry-related publications. At RADCO, his investment in technological advances and education improves the team member experience and elevates customer engagement. Known as the Multifamily Collective, reaches industry professionals across the globe who tune in daily for Mike's reflections on everything from consumer trends to employee relations, professional growth, and beyond. It's a pleasure and an honor to welcome Mike to the podcast, so let's jump right in. Well, as you know, I do love stories of origin stories and where people have come from. And I know you have a really unique story and background, and honestly, to some extent, a bit of a trying background and story as a child coming up. And I'd like to start there and hear as much as you're willing to share, because I think it really paints a really interesting picture of kind of Mike Brewer as the young guy.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to share, and I think I know we're on the heels of or past the month of mental health, or where we were really focused on mental health, and I think this story really speaks to that theme, and happy to share it. Yeah, so the very early innings of my life, my biological father passed away when I was 5 years old. It was actually in a tragic accident, an explosion, gas line in a house. And then a couple of years later, my stepfather was just really dealing with mental health himself, and took his life by his own hand. And then, let's say through my formative years, I had yet another man in my life who battled with substance abuse, alcohol specifically, and really created a lot of violence in our home. And it was sort of made for television, and I don't say that lightly, in the sense that when the crescendo happened, we actually moved out. My little sister, my mom, and myself, we moved out in the middle of the night to get out of that environment and away from that person. And God bless him. I don't think ill of him, but he was going through his own struggles, but certainly not an environment that was, conducive to a good
Mm.
rearing and raising. But then, let's say that gets me into my high school years. My mother, bless her as well, she met another gentleman, and who was a Christian, wonderful human being. But by that point, I remember having this conversation with my mom, like, look, I can't do this again. You have to wait. If you intend to marry this man, who I like very much, you're gonna have to wait until I go to college, because I can't I can't run the risk again.
Yeah.
So
Wow.
that was pretty trying childhood for certain.
And incredible story, obviously. I mean, it's in some ways it's amazing that you've ended up as a level-headed, kind, polite professional. I know that you've put in a lot of work over the years to sort of figure out a lot of that stuff for yourself as well, and kind of tease through those experiences. One of the ways that you escaped and sort of dealt with some of that as a child, I know, came through playing basketball. And I'm a basketball player by trade as well. I didn't make it to the big leagues like you did, but huge basketball fan. And obviously I cheer on my Denver Nuggets out here in Colorado. And you ended up with a full ride at Texas Tech, of all places. And this is actually one of the first things I heard about you when I came across the name Mike Brewer a few years back, as I was getting more involved in the industry. And I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit about how basketball played into that experience as a youngster and as you made your way into college.
Yeah, I think it is right to say that basketball was really my escape. Um, Obviously, it put me in social environments with friends that I still have to this day. But it was really my way to get away from what was happening in my home environment. I could go out in the driveway and shoot hoops, or even go over to friends' houses who had basketball nets, attached to their garage, or in their driveway. But it really did, and I think the passion that I had for basketball was a result of really trying to get away from those environments. And I was fortunate enough to really become very good. Now I'm 6'8", so I had the advantage of height in
Yeah,
playing
that's great.
organized basketball. But I met some incredible people, um, coaches along the way who really became father figures in my life. So not only did I escape through the actual physical playing of basketball, but I escaped through looking to men who really modeled what I thought a father should look like.
Hmm.
And I think that helped me get myself through high school with a good education, and then obviously meet the credentials to go on and play D1 basketball at Texas Tech University. And I will say, I think when I finally did make it to college, obviously there's this crescendo, wonderful flying high moment when you get awarded a scholarship and all the things that come along with that, benefits in a college environment. But I had all this stuff that I took from childhood that I drug into that right experience in
Mm,
college, and the way it manifests itself in my life, bringing this back to mental health a little bit, is that I fell into really a deep depression. I've learned through lots of counseling that was really probably PTSD, whether you call that big T trauma or little T trauma. There was quite a bit of trauma that was, let's call it, baggage that came along with me to
mm.
college. And so it manifests itself. And I ended up leaving, I think after 3 years. I left, I gave up my scholarship, and I went back to my hometown to try to regroup and figure out what I was going to do next.
Mm. This is actually a really good point, because when we have talked leading into this conversation, one of the things that you wanted to emphasize to listeners is that it doesn't really matter where you've come from. It doesn't really matter your background, college degree or no college degree. You can still get there. You can still be successful in your career, and in this case, inside multifamily. And so I want to sort of use that as the jumping off point as we dive into the story of Mike Brewer and some of the great things that you've been able to accomplish in your career so far. So let's pick things up at that point, right? So you're a young man. You've left school. You've, I don't know, had your last slam dunk on a D1 basketball court. Are you still throwing down dunks, by the way? Can you still do a
I
mean
can touch the
crossover?
rim, but I can't get the ball over them. Yeah.
Okay.
No, I
Okay.
wish. That would be awesome.
So you left the ball in the court, started your own landscaping business of all things. And as you were building this small business, you were doing something else on the side, which had to do, I guess, looking back, kind of with multifamily, kind of not, but set the stage there for us, because it's kind of a cool jumping off point.
Yeah, it's interesting to me when I look back, but I sort of had this entrepreneurial spirit. I have no idea where it came from, but it actually started prior to going to college. I tried to start a car stereo shop. It was called Car Stereos and More. That didn't go anywhere. And then when I got to college, this is sort of interesting. I learned a lesson the very hard way. We started a baseball card shop called All About Sports Cards in Lubbock, Texas. And one day I get a call from the coach of Texas Tech University, and I had to go into his office, and he said, you are part owner in a baseball card shop, and that is against NCAA rules. And I went, really? I didn't know that. So I had to give up that interest and walk away from that. So yes, fast forward to where your question was leading us. I started a landscape business when I went back to my hometown. I called it the Lawn Ranger, and play
So
on
you were meant
words.
to be in marketing.
That, yeah, I like marketing a lot, but yeah. So started the Lawn Ranger and started basically mowing grass and doing light level landscaping, and grew that up to about 100 accounts. I had 4 guys working for me at the peak. But somewhere along the line, I met a man who owned the Remax franchise in our hometown, single family home sales organization that I think is like a global company today, or it was at one point. And he paid for my real estate license. He said, I'd like for you to come to work and sell real estate for us. I'll put you through school. I'll give you an office, and we can see where that goes. So I did that. I learned really quickly that I didn't like the feast and famine of real estate, or neither the what they call the farming phase, meaning you're setting up your client base, which back then took like 4 to 6 years to get a really good
Mm,
client base. So I started buying single family homes. So when someone would call to put their house on the market, I would figure out how to get them to be the bank basically. And I buy houses on land contracts. And and the guy I went to work for actually sold me a sixplex apartment community on the same deal, a land contract where he was the bank. And so I built a little portfolio. I think 14 units was the peak I got to, but I did all the work. And this will lead to another phase of this discussion. But I did all the work. I changed out carpets, tack strip, water heaters, toilets, everything. I did everything myself because that was in
mm,
my head the way to make money, save
yeah.
money, and make money by saving money. So that's how I got into real estate.
That's wild. And how did you learn how to do that stuff? Because I think it'd be easy for me to kind of shake my head here and say, oh, it's great, Mike. Let's keep it moving here. But I have to ask, did you work with your Remax contact to learn how to do that stuff? Did you have a finance background? Did you take a few classes at Texas Tech, or what? How did you figure it all out?
No, it was I really Bob Birch was the gentleman's name. Bob took me under his wing and he taught me everything about real estate. I went to school, right? You have to get a license to sell real estate, but that doesn't teach you anything about real estate. It just teaches you how to align the sign on the front door so that you're not violating the
Mm,
ethics of the community. So anyway, Bob really taught me how to buy real estate using other people's money, if I had to put it simply. Um,
mm,
and so the foundation for what I was able to achieve started there. Him teaching me basically the rules of the road and the unconventional way to finance real estate, instead of going through banking institutions. Now, I later on learned how to do that, but in the early innings, he was really
yeah.
coaching me along the way.
That's really, I'm sure looking back, that's a huge moment in your life to have that early education and mentorship from someone in the industry that you later ended up learning a lot more about. At this point in your life, though, as the story goes, you told me, and this is when you met a girl. Is that right? Is that what happens next?
It's always about the girl, right? So, or the boy, all right?
Yeah, whatever
I
works.
yes, I started dating a girl, and she decided to go back to Lubbock, or go to Lubbock for the first time for herself. She was leaving community college to go to Texas Tech to finish her degree. And I decided I wanted to follow her since I'd already been to Texas Tech, and I was just, I think, 16 credits shy. Let's say a little over a year, a little under a year rather, of good hard work. I would have achieved my degree.
Mm,
So I followed her back to Lubbock, and I gave all the real estate to my parents, and all of a sudden they had a property management job. So yeah, that was my next step in real estate. And I went to work, interestingly enough, at a what I'd consider a traditional apartment community, 350 units, I believe, plus minus, as a leasing consultant.
okay.
So in the kind of the traditional multifamily property management business, that was my first kind of real job in the multifamily space.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Transforming Cities, brought to you by Authentic. Authentic delivers premier multifamily brand experiences and smart digital marketing. Our proven approach aims to accelerate leasing velocity, boost rental rates, and increase long-term value. Simply put, we see brand as a business asset. You can find out more at AuthenticFF.com. And what was that like? Going back to Lubbock is where Texas Tech is, if I recall correctly. Going back to Lubbock, not playing on the basketball team, sliding into this early career multifamily job. What was your headspace? Because I imagine that for me at least, I can imagine I would be like, man, I want to be playing basketball again. I kind of want to be, throwing down those dunks while I can. But also too, how did you sort of parlay that into starting a career. I mean, this is really where it started, and kind of moving up into different roles within that organization. Like, what was the mindset at that time for you?
I, I think in large part, I was really smitten by the girl I was dating at the time. She was just a wonderful human being, and I still know her to this day. So I was really smitten by her, and so my headspace was largely in that world. I It's interesting as it relates to basketball. I When I left just cold turkey full time, and
Mm,
the only time I ever really think about basketball and miss it a lot is during the tournament time in March.
okay. Yeah.
um, and I really get back into basketball. But so I wasn't in that headspace. So in my head, the the work was just something that I love to do. Real estate was something that was coming to be a real theme in my life and something I was deeply inspired by. And so I just lost myself in the girl and in the work,
Mm.
and just tried to learn everything that I possibly could about what was a new kind of segment of real estate for me in the bigger apartment communities versus these little single family homes and small
Mm.
apartment communities.
You always strike me as someone who's a little bit of a romantic, and I don't know if I'm way off base on that, but I think the way that you've described this experience, I think to myself, man, he was there for the girl and kind of there for the career and kind of figuring things out, and that's really cool. I commend you on that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
You were, I believe you moved up to a district management position. You were set to inherit kind of like a bigger role with the group. And then this opportunity came up with your friend in the Pacific Northwest out in Seattle, at Equity. And there's a really incredible, funny story that goes along with this transition and kind of when you landed in Seattle. Tell the listeners and the viewers what that was, because I think they'll get a good laugh out of that.
Yeah. So let's say it's summer of 1998. I'm sitting around doing something with the community, and I get a call on the phone, and the gentleman's name is Jim Weismiller. He's one of my really good friends still to this day. His wife is Jackie. She actually was my supervisor at the time, or was at one point. They left. They moved to Seattle. Jim calls while he's in Seattle. Says, I have this job. It's the title is general manager. The two communities are out in Silverdale, Washington, which is just kind of due west of Seattle proper by ferry. And I'd like for you to come and be the general manager. What do you think? I looked around, took inventory of my life at the time. It was my girlfriend, myself, and whatever was in my apartment. And I said, sure, let's do that. So I talked to my girlfriend. She is equally excited about doing it. So we pack up a U-Haul. We drive cross country to Seattle and unpack. And it rains for the first 91 days in a row that I lived there. And
Oh,
I'm thinking, wow, this place is really dreary and dark and rainy all the time. But I think I had mentioned to you that one of the very first things I did when I got to Seattle, mind you, I grew up in a really small town in the Bible Belt, so very conservative in nature. So the very first thing that I do when I get to Seattle, I go to a festival called Bumper Shoot. Some of you might be familiar with that. And so I recall, and I was with Jim and Jackie at the time, and I walk in the entry gates at Bumper Shoot, and let's say we're 100 yards into the festival, and I see a young man and a young woman rolling joints on the top part of their baby carriage and lighting up.
uh,
And I remember thinking to myself, I was very oddly open-minded in the same respect. I had no idea what to do with that moment, except to
yeah,
think, oh my goodness, where am I?
yeah. I've had a few Seattle experiences myself, and that very much feels like Seattle. So I I was laughing right along there with you the first time I heard that one. So you've told me that you have a love for Seattle near and dear to your heart. You know, you're not in Seattle any longer, but kind of a place that you always have fond memories of. Um, okay, so this is the second time this has come up on this podcast, but you met a girl. again. But I realized what happened to the girl that you were already moving to Seattle with. I realized I didn't get that part of the story. So something happened, and then you ended up meeting another woman. This time actually at a property, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, that's right. I'll end cap the first one because it has a good
Okay.
punchline. So she had an aspiration to be an actress and live in Hollywood. And I had decided very early on that I did not want to live in LA. I didn't want to be part of that scene. And I can't tell you exactly why, but I supported her in wanting to do that. So we ended our relationship. She moves to LA. She ends up in an episode of Dawson's Creek. That probably ages me a lot, but
Oh, cool.
it was a small part. But then she, at some point, becomes the lead singer of a rock band, and that fits her personality precisely. So very happy for her. I think she's settled down now and has a couple of children. But yes, I was working at, so fast forward, I had moved off of the peninsula over to Seattle, the Seattle side, um, and went to work in a huge apartment community. It was almost 900 units. And then I also was responsible for 100 units across the street. So let's say it's 1,000 units. And the two sides of our office, so we had administrative over here and we had leasing over here. And here's the entry door in the middle to those two types of services. So one day I'm walking out of the administrative side, headed over to the leasing side, and this woman walks in the front door, and she is amazingly beautiful. And she turns and heads toward the leasing office because she works for Ferrant Magazine and she's there to sell some advertising. And yes, it was a magazine at the time. The internet was not even a thing. I don't believe
Yeah.
it was a thing, but it wasn't of mass use. Um, so I remember she leaves the building and I walk over and I talk to the lead leasing person who she had just met with. And I said, I am going to marry that woman someday. She doesn't know it yet, but I'm going to. I fell immediately in love. This is many, many, months removed from the time that the other one had left and gone to LA. So I attempt to get her back into our office to follow through under the premise that I'm going to buy some advertising from her, which was really a ploy to try to
Of
ask her
course.
to go out on a date with me.
Yeah.
I make 4 attempts at that, and she refuses all 4 times to go out with me. But she ultimately ends up coming to work for Equity Residential as kind of an outside salesperson in the marketing arena. I'd also made a decision at the time to move to San Francisco with Equity Residential to run some assets down there. So she had just moved to Seattle. I'm moving to San Francisco. She goes to work for Equity. She happens to have my property as a sort of outside sales account, even though she's working for Equity. So she comes down to visit one day. And that particular day, early in the day, I'd received a couple of baseball tickets, San Francisco Giants tickets from my regional manager. And she walks in. So this is my 5th attempt. I said, "Hey, I have 2 baseball tickets. We're going to the game tonight, and I'm not taking no for an answer." And she finally says yes. We go to the baseball game, and the rest was history. We did end up getting married.
I was gonna say, and then she actually did say yes. What did you say? Like 6 months or so after that. So the baseball game must have been a big hit.
Big pun intended, right? Yeah, it was it was
That's
a
right.
big hit. Yeah, we hit it off, and we ended up getting married 6 months later. Yeah,
Wow. Wow.
after meeting for the first time or dating
And
for
so
the first time.
you were in the Bay Area for a little while, but then you actually ended up back in the Pacific Northwest, or like following the U.S. map of like where Mike ended up and kind of where your travels took you. But you did end up back in the Pacific Northwest, and you were there for a handful of years, I believe, before I guess a change happened in your career and kind of the trajectory, and we can talk about that in a little bit. But I believe you were an area manager, and then you sort of ended up taking over an entire market in the Pacific Northwest. Was that in Seattle, or was that by that time, was that in Portland?
Yeah, so that's a interesting story, and I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. But so I moved back to Seattle after we got married. Obviously, wanted to live in the same house, so moved back to Seattle. Um, by this time in my career, I'd made, I believe, 4 attempts to be promoted into a regional manager role, and so from general manager to regional manager, and I'd been turned down every time, and for good reasons. First couple of times I wasn't ready, but by the time the 4th or 5th time came around, I thought I was really ready. But finally, while living in Seattle, an area manager position opens in Portland, Oregon. And I make application from it. And I don't know if this was out of pity or out of the fact that I had some real merit. They gave me the job. And so we moved from Seattle to Portland. And I went to work as an area manager with 5 properties under my leadership. And then let's say 2 years removed from that point in time, I inherited the entire 16 property portfolio solo, which
Mm,
was a lot of work. Let's just put it that way.
yeah. And this is a part of the conversation that I know to some extent relates back to the mental health topics that you were talking about early on in the conversation. But this was a point in your career where you told me that you felt like by this point you were sort of blowing your marriage apart because you felt like you were becoming a workaholic in retrospect. And obviously that seems like and feels like a big shift in this journey that you've had been having so far. That being said, I know that you're comfortable talking about today, just from our previous conversations, and would love to hear a little bit more about that and lessons learned and sort of takeaways from that time.
Yeah, definitely. And it's been a long time in coming and in getting comfortable talking about it. But there are real lessons here that are germane to anybody out there that loves work and even considers work not work. They do what they love because they love what they do. But the danger in that is that if you get wholly focused on one thing in your life and you don't have some sort of balance. Now, my wife and I had 2 kids, you know, right after we got married. We were a year into our marriage for our first, and in 2 years removed from that for our second, rather. But anyway, I didn't give the time and attention to my wife and to our 2 children that I should have. I rather gave all of that time and energy to work. So get up in the morning, first thing I do is go to work. When I get home at night, I'm so mentally and physically exhausted from having worked all day. I didn't have anything left in the tank to give to them. And on the weekend, I was really recovering from
Mm.
giving up so much during the week. So my big message there for everybody is just don't fall into that trap. Really do spend time with your family. It's really, really important.
Do you
Work
have
is not
any?
everything.
No, it's not, and I'm curious if you have any rules of thumb or sort of reminders that you ended up telling yourself after coming through something like that, where you were able to more effectively switch off work brain and get into dad brain or husband brain. You know, kind of just knowing that it was time for family rather than time for work.
Yeah, I think the most honest answer is that when once you imbue those sort of habits in yourself, they're very hard to break. And so I'm still working on this today, unfortunately. And so I'm one of those individuals that when I get hyper focused on something, I have a very hard time turning that off. So I do put things in place, but I'm also the very first person to violate those things if something presents itself. So most of
Mm.
those things are built into rituals in the morning and in the evening. They're probably things that people have heard before. You put the phone in another room and you don't touch it, right? You don't get yourself in front of a screen. You don't down in front of a television. You don't do things that would be distractions from being present and center with the people that you're
Yeah.
with. So I do make attempts at being good at that, but I still struggle with it to this day, in trying to compartmentalize work from home and
Hmm.
even other things that I love to do, like running and hiking and being out in the mountains.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges for me as a young father of, and I'm not young anymore, but my son is young, old father to a young son. No, that sounds weird, but I'm learning that I'm someone who could be stuck in work a lot, as well. I like what I do. I like a lot of what I do, but I also like cycling. I like, as we've talked about, I've taken on running because I don't like running and I want to be better at it. And sometimes it's hard to tease through, okay, I'm going to stop work and go be with the family, but I also want to get a run in. And I think that's a challenging I don't know, it feels like a silly challenge to have, some days, but it's a very real thing. And I think your honesty is probably resonates with a lot of people because it's not as simple as flipping a switch and starting a new morning routine so it all goes away.
To speak to that point, I think you're right. And to speak to that point, I had convinced myself that waking up at 4 o'clock in the morning to fit all of these things in, right? Like running and reading and things that I enjoy, so that let's say by 8 o'clock, I can be front and center for my family before I go to work. The problem with that story you tell yourself is because you get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, you're really running out of fuel, right? By 5 or 6 o'clock in the evening, when you should show up with something left in the tank to give
Yeah.
to the family. So it's not, to your point, it's not just as simple as moving things around. You really just have to manage everything and try to and make concessions. You really do
Hmm.
have to make concessions and give up some things that might not otherwise serve your family well.
So speaking of that, as a result of some of those ties to work, you ended up divorcing. You had your two kids, and your wife at the time ended up moving to St. Louis of all places. So here we are again, kind of shuffling. You've covered a lot of ground, which is really cool. But you ended up following her to St. Louis, and things continued to change, and kind of a crazy story with the two of you coming back together ultimately. Which how did that happen, by the way? Because that's an incredible 180 from uh, divorcing to ultimately being back with this same woman that you fell in love with, seeing her walk in the room.
Yeah, so yes, we moved to St. Louis. Um, I followed because my kids were 1 and 3 at the time, and I didn't want to watch them grow up from afar. I wanted to really participate in their lives. So I move, and we're every other weekend, and one day during the week was the routine. And somewhere in that, let's say it's 3 or 4 years into that routine, we started to reconnect. My former wife at this time and I, we started to reconnect more intimately. We started to spend more time together as a family. By that point in time, she had purchased a house. I was still living in an apartment that the company provided to me, company that I was working for, and it just sort of organically grew back into a relationship. And yeah, 5 years married, 5 years divorced, and then we were remarried, and now we've been remarried for almost 9 years. I think we're going on 10 years of the second time around.
That's incredible. That's really incredible. Um, and a testament to, hey, things don't always go the way that you think they're going to go, but you can make it moving forward, choosing to make changes. And it sounds like that was a big time in your life and in your career where you were making changes to become more present as a dad, certainly, but as a future remarried husband, which is great.
Yeah, and I certainly don't. I want to make sure that I'm not painting the picture that, hey, Mike's now a perfect gentleman, and this, as it relates to working too much, because that still existed in my life. So yes, some of those things are true, but the alternative thing is also true. And so it's like I mentioned before, I'm still a work in progress and getting to
Yeah.
that point where there's a dichotomy, a clear dichotomy between the two things.
Mm.
So just want to make sure I'm not mismessaging here.
No, yeah, that's totally fair. So you were in St. Louis. And St. Louis is not the Pacific Northwest. St. Louis does not have beautiful water splashing up against beautiful mountains, and kind of knowing where you lived throughout the country before, be it the Pacific Northwest or San Francisco, the Bay Area. How did you handle the St. Louis life? Because I grew up in Springfield, Missouri myself, and so I understand I understand the Missouri, or as some people will call it, the misery of the central U.S. Right, and so I'm curious what happened next because it kind of ultimately it ends up leading to where you are today.
Yeah, I'm laughing there for a second to key off one of the things you said, misery. I have the habit. I read a lot, and every time I buy a book, I open it up and I write where I'm living at the time in the year I bought the book, the date I bought the book rather. And every book that I purchased while I lived in Missouri, I wrote misery and then and then the date. And that's not to take anything away from St. Louis. It is a wonderful city and a neat place to raise a family. But to your point, landlocked, not aesthetically pleasing for someone who had just come from the Pacific Northwest. I really do consider that God's country. It's just everything about it is beautiful and green and lush. So um, I had a terrible mindset when I first moved to St. Louis, and it took me the better part of the 18 to 24 months to get myself in a real good mental state as it related to that piece because I couldn't just take
Mm,
off and go to the mountains, or I couldn't just take off and put a kayak in the water, or any of the stuff that I had started to enjoy doing in the Pacific Northwest. So I got over it. Let's put it that way. It took me a little while to get over it.
yeah. So you told me that you were actually deciding around that time what's next after St. Louis, and you were looking back towards the Pacific Northwest. I think you actually reached out to a colleague and friend of yours, but it actually pointed you east instead of west. So what was that? What was that story? What was that transition to what is where you are today, which is Atlanta?
Yeah. So a little context there. So Stephanie and I both love the outdoors, and the reason for wanting to get back to the Pacific Northwest was because of that. We collectively love that. We love being outside. And I had actually gone out to Portland, and I met with a number of people trying to get myself back out there. And while I was there, I called a friend who has a huge Rolodex in the multifamily space to ask if he knew anyone else in Portland that I could talk to before I flew back to St. Louis. And he said, I do not. Not we went through the names I'd already talked to, but I'm actually in Atlanta now, and I work for a company called RADCO Residential, and we are looking for someone. And if you're interested, I'd love to meet with you. This was a Friday that I was talking to him, and he said, if you can get yourself out here by next Wednesday, we'll do an interview, and if things work out, we can potentially offer you a position. So I did that, and I was offered a position. And so instead of moving west, we moved east, and I think that was 2016.
And the story that you told yourselves was you are not landlocked in Atlanta. You have the beach, you have the Gulf, you have some hills and mountains in the area, so you're good. How has that turned out, by the way? Do you get out to the hills and to the coasts?
Uh, we do more so the hills. So even though I like going to the coast, I wouldn't consider myself an ocean person. Like I don't like to go to the ocean and sit on the beach is the punchline. So yes, we do a fair amount of hiking um, and camping and getting up north of Georgia as often as we possibly, or north of Atlanta rather, as often as we can.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to jump into Radco topics because that's how I first came to know you. You know, Mike at Radco. Super smart, intelligent, thoughtful human being inside this multifamily industry. And so, when you joined Radco, you told me that that was during a time of some pretty significant expansion, rapid changes throughout the company. You kind of dove in head first. Things were moving really quickly. But afterwards, you mentioned that there was actually a lot of downsizing that occurred, changes with the company outlook and some of the structure. Um, Gosh, what were those first few years like? Because I imagine it was just sort of like a whirlwind, maybe sort of like feeling like you're in a washing machine to some extent.
That's a great analogy. That's exactly what it felt like. Yeah, we got here, and I think at some point right prior to or right after the company had reached its peak, like 33,000 apartment homes, and through buying and selling, it was slightly less than I think when I got here. But we we continue to buy properties and selling properties at the same time, but it was more of an upward trajectory, and I was excited. It seemed like it was a rocket ship. It was probably going to sit somewhere in the NMHC top 50 at some point. And then let's say 2 years in, so 2018, 2019, a lot of things started to shift in the marketplace, and a lot of things started to shift in the organization. So we were reorganizing, attempting to grow more. but something seemed to be happening in the environment that would lend to the idea that you should start to sell the assets, or begin to at least
Mm,
strategically sell some assets. Now, the owner that I work for, he's incredibly insightful, Norman Radout, incredibly insightful, and seems to have this sort of magic crystal ball that he can look into that's like 18 to 20 more, 4 months removed from now. And he seems to have the Midas touch in making decisions. So all that being said, we started to sell assets, and then let's say maybe 18 months removed from that, we're now in 2020, right? So March of 2020, we all know what happens around that moment in time. COVID starts to present its ugly head. And there's this pause of like 6 months plus minus where nothing really happens. No one knows whether we should buy properties or sell properties, or even service properties became difficult, right? But 6 months removed from the time that we went into COVID, price discovery had happened and the market just turned loose. And we sold almost everything.
mm,
We got down, and we're presently at 1,200 owned units from this peak of like 33,000 at some point. So all the way down to
wow.
1,200 units.
Wow.
Yes, and that brought a lot of angst and turmoil and chaos along with it.
I'm sure. And with your role at Radco, um, I'm sure and I know that you were, because we talked about how difficult this was. You had to have upwards of multiple hundreds of conversations around changes in company staffing and leadership, and I know that wasn't an easy thing for you in the company.
That's right. Let's say at our peak, we were somewhere between 300 and 400 team members. And obviously, when you downsize, and you downsize that swiftly, you have a lot of conversations, either directly or indirectly. We laid off. I personally had a lot of conversations, but indirectly a lot more. Um, we laid off the better part of 250 people.
Mm,
Now, mind you, we sell a property. Those people are still employed with the property in a new management company. So I'm calling it a layoff, even though a lot of people landed on their feet with other companies.
hmm.
But there were a fair amount of people who didn't have jobs when we laid them off. But we have an owner that is unbelievably generous, just innately generous, and so we provided a real runway for those individuals in the way of severance packages and giving them time to interview while they were doing their day job, but we were giving them time to go and interview or make application, or helping them with resumes, or helping them find headhunters to find other employment. So I think we did that as gracefully as we possibly could, even though it was a bit of an adverse
Yeah.
circumstance for everyone.
That kind of leads into 2021-ish, a year, 18 months or so later, when you said that the leadership team at Radco decided that this, kind of bull run had officially ended, or that it would be ending soon, and that it was time to change course to some extent with the business and kind of the mentality of what the business had been prior. And I believe that was in early 2021. What were those decisions? What were you seeing as a group, and where did you ultimately start to point that compass for the company?
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of full circle story. So Norman, um, the origin of the Radco companies is in hotels, and so he actually gained control of the Ritz Carlton, I believe, I'm sorry, Four Seasons. Sorry, Four Seasons Hotel in downtown Atlanta, or midtown Atlanta. And he gained control of that and did a renovation. And that was his first real estate project here in Atlanta. So that was the origin of the Radco companies. So you go through a cycle of hotels and doing some workout business and get into multifamily. And to your question, we decide that we're going to pivot back into the hotel space because COVID had obviously crushed the travel industry, both from a business perspective and a leisure perspective. And Norman, along with others, thought that the hotel space would be a very good place to move into, because when the recovery came around, when people started to travel again, you'd be there in a good position to capitalize on it. So we started doing that and making a few purchases in the multifamily space along with it.
One of the other big changes, as I understand it, is this decision to move into property management as well and make that a bigger piece of the pie. How did you see that fitting into the the hospitality space as well as some of the additional purchases that you were slowly making at the time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So as we were downsizing, we decided at some point we wanted to keep a core group of people together. We call it an infrastructure, or we refer to it that way. We want to keep it a little bit of an infrastructure together because as cycles go, you go into a dip and then you have a trough and then you start back up again. And let's say we're in a trough right now, just for sake of conversation. We wanted to have core group together, go through the trough, really refine our systems, our disciplines, our routines, so that when this happens again, we're not building it from behind. So to your question, we built a third party property management company. We really didn't build it. We already had it because it's a property management company within the RADCO companies that manage the RADCO assets. So
Mm.
we just simply started to market that to outside third parties, and picked up several clients. We're now about 5,000 units. We have some big goals. We're trying to get to 10,000 units by the end of this year. But we kept the infrastructure in place so that the next time, or the next cycle that comes around, we're really primed and ready to take advantage
Yeah.
of it.
Speaking of goals, you told me that you have a something you call a big hairy goal starting up, and it has to do with a unit count goal by the end of 2025. Um, if you have the courage, can you say out loud what that what that goal is for us all to hear on this podcast that's recorded in 2023?
Yes, I will do that. I have to say this before I say that. So somebody lives, I think, up the road from you in Colorado Springs, Jim Collins. He wrote a book called Good to Great. And in that book, he describes something called the Big, Hairy, Audacious Goal, or the BHAG. And that's where I borrowed that term from. So I borrowed the BHAG from Jim Collins, and we have set our BHAG at 25,000 units by 2025. Uh, Partly because 25 and 25 sounds fun to say together, but partly
Yeah.
because I think you have to have a big, hairy, audacious goal to run after.
And how many of those units would be third party versus owned, or I should say, like, what's sort of the goal for that mix?
Yeah, definitely. I think in a perfect world, we would always own more than we do third-party property management for. But I think realistically, we'll probably end up somewhere around 60% third party and
Mm,
40% owned. But I think those ratios, they really change over time as it relates to what's going on in the market. So
yeah.
as you have buying opportunities, you probably weigh out heavier on the own side, less on the third party, and it flips when the
Yeah.
cycle goes the other way.
A big part of this change, I know for you, being so vocal about technology and some of the current trends in the industry has to do with the tech stack for RADCO, on-site teams, residents, and how to sort of participate together and feel like it's all a cohesive unit. But as you have mentioned to me in the past and how you vocalized before on LinkedIn and other formats, that that technology stack is not black or white. It's not necessarily something that can be consistently perfect and sort of perfected across the board, especially when we're referring to third-party assets as well as owned assets. What are you moving towards as a business, and what are the things that you're thinking about from a technology standpoint over the next couple of years?
Yeah. So I always love to start with the end in mind, and I'll make this hopefully really brief. So Bill Gates, a long time ago, had a vision to put a PC on every single desk in the world just so he could put his operating system on it, right? And so I really am personally on a mission to take all of those devices out of our offices almost wholly and completely, because I want to get back. I believe this can happen. We can get back to a moment in time where you and I can sit in a space not distracted by technology and actually look each other in the eye and have a real conversation, right? Not distracted, and be with each other. And I say that to say this: I think that real estate is really predicated on relationships, right? Relationship oriented business. Instead, we've really created what I'd refer to as a transaction oriented type business where we're always transacting something in the spaces that we work in. So I want to get completely away from that. This is probably not the right way to put it, but I want to disappear all of the technology so we can have that space again.
Mm,
So that does require a lot of technology. I think that artificial intelligence, whether it's baked into current day applications or property management systems, is going to play a big role in that. I think there are sort of two schools of thought out there about artificial intelligence right now. I really love it. I think that a lot of people are using it for creative purposes today, which I think is a right way to think about it. But I also think there's an alternative way to think about that, and that is using artificial intelligence to really mine your data. Um, and in mining that data, have that data reveal to you what really will move your business in a relationship oriented way. So in my head, you sort of use AI to go first to mine data to get insights, and then you use AI to do creative out of those insights, if that makes sense.
mm,
And
yeah.
I think we can use AI to bolt together the workflows that allow us to disappear the technology and have consumers do a little bit of stuff themselves, us do a little bit of stuff, but leave a lot of room for you and I to have conversation face to face
Mm.
and in presence.
And when you think about this at RADCO, does it sit behind, from a marketing perspective, a brand, like a parent brand? Is it just RADCO, or are you needing to sort of come up with a new way to describe what this experience will be in the future?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question. I think I think so. There's a company called Central. I'm sure a lot of people are very familiar with that, and I really do think, to your point about branding, I think that is the right way to think about the future of housing and sort of creating these environments that really have a brand identity, but a consumer experience that goes along with it that sort of shores it up or ladders up into it, and doesn't only include the community, but rather the broader community. You're transforming cities, right? I like that because I think our apartment community sits inside of a city block or several city blocks, and all of those accoutrements, right? All of those neighborhood amenities, they all play together. And when you can connect them, right, and you can put the human in the center of that, and you can allow all of those experiences to build humans into better humans, and you can create collision points where neighbors
Mm.
can become friends and friends can become, right, marriage partners or
Mm-hmm.
whatever. It all, in my head, in a utopian sort of way, builds health into our environment, and
Mm-hmm.
it all starts with these apartment
I
communities.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. I believe strongly, and the term is overused at this point, but when we think about the term human-centered design, I always think about how real estate is still catching up to what that means, and maybe more specifically, how that can actually be rolled out to a community and its surrounding accoutrements, as you mentioned, and what are those ways that you can connect a community, an apartment community, to its local community, and how can you create those collision points much earlier on through even the design of a property, the design of the brand experience itself. How does that tie into the local coffee shop, the local flower shop, the deli down the street, right? And so what are these ways that all of that can come together and to your point, sort of be just seamless and hidden within a single piece of tech that
Right.
is just feels effortless. So I'm tracking with you there. I think that is the way forward as well. And I know that we see eye to eye on that one.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you're familiar with the villages in Florida, but I take a lot of inspiration from that built community. It's an active adult community, but they are doing a lot of things with technology that create these seamless experiences for active adults. It's pretty interesting.
That's great. No, I don't know too much about it. I will seek it and I'll definitely make sure we add it to the show notes here.
Definitely. Yep.
Before we wrap up, I don't want to run away without talking about your own podcast, though. Multifamily Collective. I mean, you're probably on episode 5,000 by now or something like that. I mean, you pump those things out, and you're so dedicated to it. I love it. So I highly encourage everyone to listen to it if you're not already subscribed. But one of the cool things about it that I think sort of starts to begin to tie this bow that has been your career is that you have made it a way for you to catalog experiences and give back to the multifamily community. And I'm curious to hear you expand upon that concept and what it means to you as you start to think about your career in its last leg at this point, and kind of what you're hoping to accomplish over the next many years before you ultimately decide to say, multifamily, here it is. Here are my lessons.
Yeah, and thank you for those kind words. By the way, that's very generous of you. I actually started Multifamily Collective. It was actually Mike Brewer and Things was the very first name for the podcast. But back then it was just a blog. When blogs sounded like you were clearing your throat, nobody knew what it was.
Yeah.
But
Weblog.
anyway, I started writing articles in 2006 or 2007. So we have some 3,000 written articles about the multifamily space. And then, yeah, we're on episode 1,500 of the podcast and blog. And I think we have 80 or so episodes of interviews like this. But I started the whole thing, especially the video version of it, because I'm painfully shy. I'm very socially awkward. If you ever meet me out in public, it's very hard to have a conversation with me because I have ADD and Asperger's, and I'm very distracted in big group environments. So, but I knew if I wanted to grow in my career, and this is a lesson I would say to anybody who's introverted and maybe has some of those ailments, it's very hard to advance in roles of leadership if you're not comfortable speaking in front of the public. And so I started the vlog because I wanted to get comfortable in front of a camera, because I knew that would segue into being comfortable in front of audiences, right? I could do the reps in a low risk environment so that I could go and do the real work in front of a big group of people. So to speak to your question, I really cataloged. I wanted to, it's a journal, basically. I wanted to catalog everything that I did along the way, in the way of what I consider to be life lessons and or business lessons, and be able to give that back at some point. Everything that I know about the multifamily industry, I learned from other people who are very generous with their time and with their intellect. Learned a lot of it out of books too. And so in my head, if I can condense that into 1 to 3 minute post every single day, and then interviews that are a little more lengthy, and some written articles along the way, I feel like that's my way of giving back to the industry that has given so much to me.
Well, I want to, I don't think you know this and we've never talked about it, but you are one of the first people that I watched on screen as my business transitioned into the multifamily industry about 5 years ago. And I'm like you, I'm introverted. I have much lower comfort in big groups of people as opposed to many of our peers. And I approached this podcast and these conversations with that exact same mindset. It forces me to become more comfortable in conversation and obviously learn more at the same time. I think this actually happened very recently where someone said, oh, you do your social media posting and you're on the video all the time, so you must be really comfortable speaking to an audience. And I kind of smiled because I said to myself, no way, I'm not comfortable at all doing this, but it's just what we need to do. And so I'm right there with you. I'm another more introverted person who feels like this is just a great medium to do that. And so I second your encouragement of others just stepping into the limelight at least a little bit and just to get more comfortable with it.
Yeah, that's right.
So let's wrap up here with a couple rapid fire. The first one is the most exciting technology you've seen in the last year. I think we know what the answer is just because you talk about it a lot. You share a lot of great insight about it, but riff off a couple quick thoughts about AI and why you think it's going to matter in the next couple of years.
Yeah, I think we said, or I said most of what I'm excited about. I just think that it really is going to take away a lot of the routine work that we are accustomed to in this industry. It is going to allow us to disappear a lot of the technology so that we can really reintroduce the humanities into the work that we do, and I'm super excited about that. And look, it's early innings, and I think people are still trying to figure out how to bolt it together, and it'll probably be,
Mm.
who knows, 18 to 24 months. That's me crystal ball thinking or licking my finger, waving it in the air. But I think it will be the predicate for some super interesting things in our space. I'm excited about it.
How about as a reader, as an avid reader, what is a book that you would recommend to the listeners?
Oh man, I knew you were asking this question. So this is when breath becomes air, and I will forewarn everyone, it's a very sad story. But I think, and I won't give away the punchline lesson, but it is a lesson that we've talked about it here a little bit. But I would encourage you to read it and really take it to heart and apply the big punchline lesson that you will get out of it. It's hugely impactful book.
You're leaving us on a cliffhanger. We'll also link to that in the show notes though, so that everyone can grab a copy. Mike, it's been a huge pleasure. I feel like we're a couple of just introverted guys that could hang out over some coffee. For you, I think it's usually some mushroom coffee.
That's right.
And just chat about stuff. So thank you so much again for joining me. And really the only other thing to do here is roll out the red carpet for you and ask where the world can find you online and kind of what you're up to these days.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thank you for this time. I really do appreciate it. And I agree with you. We could probably talk for hours and hours and hours. I think online LinkedIn is probably the best way to find me. We do have multifamilycollective.com. You can sign up. We have a newsletter there, and that's where we post all of our content. There in YouTube and other sort of social media platforms. But I'm pretty easy to find online.
Great, I love it. We'll link to all that in our show notes. If you get some new stalkers or DMs, tell them I say hello. But Mike, thank you again for joining me today. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate it. Likewise.